Book I. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. But a certain difference is found among ends. Some are activities, others are products apart from the activities that produce them. Where there are ends apart from the actions, it is the nature of the products to be better than the activity. Now, as there are many actions, arts, and sciences, their ends also are many. The end of the medical art is health, that of shipbuilding a vessel, that of strategy victory, that of economics wealth. But where such arts fall under a single capacity as bridle making, and the other arts concerned with the equipment of horses fall under the art of riding, and this and every military action under strategy, in the same way other arts fall under yet others. In all of these the ends of the master arts are to be preferred to all the subordinate ends, for it is for the sake of the former that the latter are pursued. It makes no difference whether the activities themselves are the ends of the actions, or something else apart from the activities, as in the case of the sciences just mentioned. If then there is some end of the things we do which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, and if we do not choose everything for the sake of something else, for at that rate the process would go on to infinity, so that our desire would be empty and vain, clearly this must be the good and the chief good. Will not the knowledge of it, then, have a great influence on life? Shall we not, like archers who have a mark to aim at, be more likely to hit upon what is right? If so, we must try in outline at least to determine what it is, and of which of the sciences or capacities it is the object. It would seem to belong to the most authoritative art, and that which is most truly the master art. And politics appears to be of this nature, for it is this that ordains which of the sciences should be studied in a state, and which each class of citizens should learn, and up to what point they should learn them. And we see even the most highly esteemed of capacities to fall under this, e.g. strategy, economics, rhetoric. Now, since politics uses the rest of the sciences, and since, again, it legislates as to what we are to do and what we are to abstain from, the end of this science must include those of the others, so that this end must be the good for man. For even if the end is the same for a single man and for a state, that of the state seems at all events something greater and more complete whether to attain or to preserve. Though it is worthwhile to attain the end merely for one man, it is finer and more godlike to attain it for nation or for city-states. These, then, are the ends at which our inquiry aims, since it is political science in one sense of that term. Our discussion will be adequate if it has as much clearness as the subject matter admits of, for precision is not to be sought for alike in all discussions, any more than in all the products of the crafts. Now fine and just actions which political science investigates admit of much variety and fluctuation of opinion, so that they may be thought to exist only by convention and not by nature. And goods also give rise to a similar fluctuation, because they bring harm to many people. For before now men have been undone by reason of their wealth, and others by reason of their courage. We must be content then in speaking of such subjects and with such premises to indicate the truth roughly and in outline, and in speaking about things which are only for the most part true, and with premises of the same kind to reach conclusions that are no better. In the same spirit, therefore, should each type of statement be received, for it is the mark of an educated man to look for precision in each class of things, just so far as the nature of the subject admits. It is evidently equally foolish to accept probable reasoning from a mathematician, and to demand from a rhetorician scientific proofs. Now each man judges well the things he knows, and of these he is a good judge. And so the man who has been educated in a subject is a good judge of that subject, and the man who has received an all-round education is a good judge in general. Hence a young man is not a proper hearer of lectures on political science, for he is inexperienced in the actions that occur in life, but its discussions start from these and are about these, and further. Since he tends to follow his passions, his study will be vain and unprofitable, because the end aimed at is not knowledge but action. And it makes no difference whether he is young in years or youthful in character. The defect does not depend on time, but on his living and pursuing each successive object as passion directs. For to such persons as to the incontinent, knowledge brings no profit, but to those who desire and act in accordance with a rational principle, knowledge about such matters will be of great benefit. These remarks about the student, the sort of treatment to be expected, and the purpose of the inquiry may be taken as our preface. Let us resume our inquiry and state, in view of the fact that all knowledge and every pursuit aims at some good, what it is that we say political science aims at, and what is the highest of all goods achievable by action. Verbally there is very general agreement, for both the general run of men and people of superior refinement say that it is happiness, and identify living well and doing well with being happy, but with regard to what happiness is they differ. And the many do not give the same account as the wise. For the former think it is some plain and obvious thing, like pleasure, wealth, or honor, They differ, however, from one another, and often even the same man identifies it with different things, with health when he is ill, with wealth when he is poor. But conscious of their ignorance, they admire those who proclaim some great ideal that is above their comprehension. Now some thought that apart from these many goods there is another which is self-subsistent, and causes the goodness of all these as well. To examine all the opinions that have been held were perhaps somewhat fruitless, enough to examine those that are most prevalent or that seem to be arguable. Let us not fail to notice, however, that there is a difference between arguments from and those to the first principles. For Plato too was right in raising this question and asking, as he used to do, are we on the way from or to the first principle? There is a difference, as there is in a race course, between the course from the judges to the turning point and the way back. For while we must begin with what is known, things are objects of knowledge in two senses, some to us, some without qualification. Presumably then, we must begin with things known to us. Hence anyone who is to listen intelligently to lectures about what is noble and just, and generally about the subjects of political science, must have been brought up in good habits. For the fact is the starting point, and if this is sufficiently plain to him, he will not at the start need the reason as well, and the man who has been well brought up has or can easily get starting points. And as for him who neither has nor can get them, let him hear the words of Hesiod. Far best is he who knows all things himself, good he that hearkens when men counsel right, but he who neither knows nor lays to heart another's wisdom is a useless wight. Let us, however, resume our discussion from the point at which we digressed. To judge from the lives that men lead, most men, and men of the most vulgar type, seem not without some ground to identify the good or happiness with pleasure, which is the reason why they love the life of enjoyment. For there are, we may say, three prominent types of life that just mentioned, the political, and thirdly the contemplative life. Now the mass of mankind are evidently quite slavish in their tastes, preferring a life suitable to beasts, but they get some ground for their view from the fact that many of those in high places share the tastes of Sardanapalus. A consideration of the prominent types of life shows that people of superior refinement and of active disposition identify happiness with honor, for this is, roughly speaking, the end of the political life. But it seems too superficial to be what we are looking for, since it is thought to depend on those who bestow honor rather than on him who receives it, but the good we divine to be something proper to a man and not easily taken from him. Further, men seem to pursue honor in order that they may be assured of their goodness. At least it is by men of practical wisdom that they seek to be honored, and among those who know them, and on the ground of their virtue. Clearly then, according to them, at any rate, virtue is better. And perhaps one might even suppose this to be, rather than honor, the end of the political life. But even this appears somewhat incomplete, for possession of virtue seems actually compatible with being asleep, or with lifelong inactivity, and further with the greatest sufferings and misfortunes. But a man who is living so no one would call happy unless he were maintaining a thesis at all costs. But enough of this, for the subject has been sufficiently treated even in the current discussions. Third comes the contemplative life, which we shall consider later. The life of money-making is one undertaken under compulsion, and wealth is evidently not the good we are seeking, for it is merely useful and for the sake of something else. And so one might rather take the aforenamed objects to be ends, for they are loved for themselves, but it is evident that not even these are ends, yet many arguments have been thrown away in support of them. Let us leave this subject then. Yet perhaps better consider the universal good and discuss thoroughly what is meant by it, although such an inquiry is made an uphill one by the fact that the forms have been introduced by friends of our own. Yet it would perhaps be thought to be better, indeed to be our duty, for the sake of maintaining the truth, even to destroy what touches us closely, especially as we are philosophers or lovers of wisdom. For while both are dear, piety requires us to honor truth above our friends. The men who introduced this doctrine did not posit ideas of classes within which they recognized priority and posteriority, which is the reason why they did not maintain the existence of an idea embracing all numbers. But the term good is used both in the category of substance and in that of quality and in that of relation, and that which is per se, i.e. substance, is prior in nature to the relative, for the latter is like an offshoot and accident of being. So that there could not be a common idea set over all these goods. Further, since good has as many senses as being, for it is predicated both in the category of substance, as of God, and of reason, and in quality, i.e. of the virtues, and in quantity, i.e. of that which is moderate, and in relation, i.e. of the useful, and in time, i.e. of the right opportunity, and in place, i.e. of the right locality, and the like. Clearly it cannot be something universally present in all cases and single, for then it could not have been predicated in all the categories, but in one only. Further, since of the things answering to one idea there is one science, there would have been one science of all the goods, but as it is there are many sciences even of the things that fall under one category, e.g. of opportunity. For opportunity in war is studied by strategics, and in disease by medicine, and the moderate in food is studied by medicine and in exercise by the science of gymnastics. And one might ask the question, what in the world they mean by a thing itself is, as is the case, in man himself, and in a particular man the account of man is one and the same. For insofar as they are man, they will in no respect differ, and if this is so, neither will good itself in particular goods in so far as they are good. But again it will not be good any the more for being eternal, since that which lasts long is no whiter than that which perishes in a day. The Pythagoreans seem to give a more plausible account of the good, when they place the one in the column of goods, and it is they that Speusippus seems to have followed. But let us discuss these matters elsewhere. An objection to what we have said, however, may be discerned in the fact that the Platonists have not been speaking about all goods, and that the goods that are pursued and loved for themselves are called good by reference to a single form, while those which tend to produce or to preserve these somehow or to prevent their contraries are called so by reference to these, and in a secondary sense. Clearly, then, goods must be spoken of in two ways. And some must be good in themselves, the others by reason of these. Let us separate, then, things good in themselves from things useful, and consider whether the former are called good by reference to a single idea. What sort of goods would one call good in themselves? Is it those that are pursued even when isolated from others, such as intelligence, sight, and certain pleasures and honors? Certainly, if we pursue these also for the sake of something else, yet one would place them among things good in themselves. Or is nothing other than the idea of good in itself? In that case the form will be empty. But if the things we have named are also things good in themselves, the account of the good will have to appear as something identical in them all. As that of whiteness is identical in snow and in white lead, but of honor, wisdom, and pleasure, just in respect of their goodness, the accounts are distinct and diverse. The good, therefore, is not some common element answering to one idea. But what then do we mean by the good? It is surely not like the things that only chance to have the same name. Are goods one then by being derived from one good, or by all contributing to one good, or are they rather one by analogy? Certainly as sight is in the body, so is reason in the soul, and so on in other cases. But perhaps these subjects had better be dismissed for the present, for perfect precision about them would be more appropriate to another branch of philosophy. And similarly with regard to the idea, even if there is some one good which is universally predicable of goods, or is capable of separate and independent existence, clearly it could not be achieved or attained by man, but we are now seeking something attainable. Perhaps, however, someone might think it worthwhile to recognize this with a view to the goods that are attainable and achievable. For having this as a sort of pattern, we shall know better the goods that are good for us, and if we know them, shall attain them. This argument has some plausibility, but seems to clash with the procedure of the sciences, for all of these, though they aim at some good and seek to supply the deficiency of it, leave on one side the knowledge of the good. Yet that all the exponents of the arts should be ignorant of, and should not even seek, so great an aid is not probable. It is hard, too, to see how a weaver or a carpenter will be benefited in regard to his own craft by knowing this good itself, or how the man who has viewed the idea itself will be a better doctor or general thereby. For doctor seems not even to study health in this way, but the health of man, or perhaps rather the health of a particular man. It is individuals that he is healing. But enough of these topics. Let us again return to the good we are seeking and ask what it can be. It seems different in different actions and arts. It is different in medicine, in strategy, and in the other arts likewise. What then is the good of each? Surely that for whose sake everything else is done. In medicine this is health, in strategy victory, in architecture a house, in any other sphere something else, and in every action and pursuit the end. For it is for the sake of this that all men do whatever else they do. Therefore, if there is an end for all that we do, this will be the good achievable by action, and if there are more than one, these will be the goods achievable by action. So the argument has by a different course reached the same point, but we must try to state this even more clearly. Since there are evidently more than one end, and we choose some of these, e.g. wealth, flutes, and in general instruments, for the sake of something else, clearly not all ends are final ends, but the chief good is evidently something final. Therefore, if there is only one final end, this will be what we are seeking, and if there are more than one, the most final of these will be what we are seeking. Now we call that which is in itself worthy of pursuit more final than that which is worthy of pursuit for the sake of something else, and that which is never desirable for the sake of something else more final than the things that are desirable both in themselves and for the sake of that other thing. And therefore we call final without qualification that which is always desirable in itself and never for the sake of something else. Now such a thing happiness above all else is held to be. For this we choose always for self and never for the sake of something else, but honor, pleasure, reason, and every virtue we choose indeed for themselves. For if nothing resulted from them we should still choose each of them, but we choose them also for the sake of happiness, judging that by means of them we shall be happy. Happiness, on the other hand, no one chooses for the sake of these, nor in general, for anything other than itself. From the point of view of self-sufficiency, the same result seems to follow, for the final good is thought to be self-sufficient. Now, by self-sufficient, we do not mean that which is sufficient for man by himself, for one who lives a solitary life, but also for parents, children, wife, and in general for his friends and fellow citizens, since man is born for citizenship. But some limit must be set to this. For if we extend our requirement to ancestors and descendants and friends, we are in for an infinite series. Let us examine this question, however, on another occasion. The self-sufficient we now define as that which when isolated makes life desirable and lacking in nothing, and such we think happiness to be. And further, we think it most desirable of all things, without being counted as one good thing among others. If it were so counted, it would clearly be made more desirable by the addition of even the least of goods. For that which is added becomes an excess of goods. And of goods the greater is always more desirable. Happiness, then, is something final and self-sufficient, and is the end of action. Presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems a platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired. This might perhaps be given if we could first ascertain the function of man. For just as for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in the function, so would it seem to be for man if he has a function. Have the carpenter, then, and the tanner certain functions or activities, and has man none? Is he born without a function, or as eye, hand, foot, and in general each of the parts evidently has a function? May one lay it down that man similarly has a function apart from all these? What then can this be? Life seems to be common even to plants, but we are seeking what is peculiar to man. Let us exclude, therefore, the life of nutrition and growth. Next, there would be a life of perception, but it also seems to be common even to the horse, the ox, and every animal. There remains, then, an active life of the element that has a rational principle. Of this, one part has such a principle in the sense of being obedient to one, the other in the sense of possessing one and exercising thought. And as life of the rational element also has two meanings. We must state that life in the sense of activity is what we mean, for this seems to be the more proper sense of the term. Now, if the function of man is an activity of soul which follows or implies a rational principle, and if we say so-and-so and a good so-and-so have a function which is the same in kind, e.g., a liar and a good lyre player, and so without qualification in all cases, eminence and respect of goodness being added to the name of the function. For the function of a lyre player is to play the lyre, and that of a good lyre player is to do so well. If this is the case, and we state the function of man to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or actions of the soul implying a rational principle, and the function of a good man to be the good and noble performance of these. And if any action is well performed when it is performed in accordance with the appropriate excellence, if this is the case, human good turns out to be activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. But we must add in a complete life, for one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day, and so too one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy. Let this serve as an outline of the good, for we must presumably first sketch it roughly, and then later fill in the details. But it would seem that anyone is capable of carrying on and articulating what has once been well outlined, and that time is a good discoverer or partner in such a work, to which facts the advances of the arts are due, for anyone can add what is lacking, and we must also remember what has been said before. And not look for precision in all things alike, but in each class of things such precision as accords with the subject matter, and so much as is appropriate to the inquiry. For a carpenter and a geometer investigate the right angle in different ways. The former does so in so far as the right angle is useful for his work, while the latter inquires what it is or what sort of thing it is, for he is a spectator of the truth. We must act in the same way then in all other matters as well, that our main task may not be subordinated to minor questions. Nor must we demand the cause in all matters alike. It is enough in some cases that the fact be well established, as in the case of the first principles, the fact is the primary thing or first principle. Now of first principles we see some by induction, some by perception, some by a certain habituation, and others too in other ways. But each set of principles we must try to investigate in the natural way, and we must take pains to state them definitely, since they have a great influence on what follows. For the beginning is thought to be more than half of the whole, and many of the questions we ask are cleared up by it. We must consider it, however, in the light not only of our conclusion and our premises, but also of what is commonly said about it. For with a true view all the data harmonize, but with a false one the facts soon clash. Now goods have been divided into three classes, and some are described as external, others as relating to soul or to body. We call those that relate to soul most properly and truly goods. And psychical actions and activities we class as relating to soul. Therefore our account must be sound, at least according to this view, which is an old one and agreed on by philosophers. It is correct also in that we identify the end with certain actions and activities, for thus it falls among goods of the soul and not among external goods. Another belief which harmonizes with our account is that the happy man lives well and does well, for we have practically defined happiness as a sort of good life and good action. The characteristics that are looked for in happiness seem also all of them to belong to what we have defined happiness as being. For some identify happiness with virtue, some with practical wisdom, others with a kind of philosophic wisdom, others with these or one of these, accompanied by pleasure or not without pleasure, while others include also external prosperity. Now some of these views have been held by many men and men of old, others by a few eminent persons, and it is not probable that either of these should be entirely mistaken, but rather that they should be right in at least some respect, or even in most respects. With those who identify happiness with virtue or someone virtue, our account is in harmony, for to virtue belongs virtuous activity. But it makes perhaps no small difference whether we place the chief good in possession or in use, in state of mind or in activity. For the state of mind may exist without producing any good result, as in a man who is asleep or in some other way quite inactive, but the activity cannot. For one who has the activity will of necessity be acting and acting well. And as in the Olympic Games, it is not the most beautiful and the strongest that are crowned, but those who compete, for it is some of these that are victorious. So those who act win, and rightly win, the noble and good things in life. Their life is also in itself pleasant, for pleasure is a state of soul, and to each man that which he is said to be a lover of is pleasant. E.g., not only is a horse pleasant to the lover of horses, and a spectacle to the lover of sights, but also in the same way just acts are pleasant to the lover of justice, and in general virtuous acts to the lover of virtue. Now for most men their pleasures are in conflict with one another, because these are not by nature pleasant, but the lovers of what is noble find pleasant the things that are by nature pleasant, and virtuous actions are such, so that these are pleasant for such men as well as in their own nature. Their life, therefore, has no further need of pleasure as a sort of adventitious charm, but has its pleasure in itself. For besides what we have said, the man who does not rejoice in noble actions is not even good, since no one would call a man just who did not enjoy acting justly, nor any man liberal who did not enjoy liberal actions, and similarly in all other cases. If this is so, virtuous actions must be in themselves pleasant, but they are also good and noble, and have each of these attributes in the highest degree, since the good man judges well about these attributes. His judgment is such as we have described. Happiness then is the best, noblest, and most pleasant thing in the world, and these attributes are not severed as in the inscription at Delos. Most noble is that which is justest, and best is health. But pleasantest is it to win what we love. For all these properties belong to the best activities, and these, or one the best of these, we identify with happiness. Yet evidently, as we said, it needs the external goods as well, for it is impossible, or not easy, to do noble acts without the proper equipment. In many actions we use friends and riches and political power as instruments, and there are some things the lack of which takes the luster from happiness, as good birth, goodly children, beauty. For the man who is very ugly in appearance, or ill-born, or solitary, and childless is not very likely to be happy. And perhaps a man would be still less likely if he had thoroughly bad children or friends, or had lost good children or friends by death. As we said then, happiness seems to need this sort of prosperity in addition, for which reason some identify happiness with good fortune, though others identify it with virtue. For this reason also the question is asked, whether happiness is to be acquired by learning or by habituation or some other sort of training, or comes in virtue of some divine providence or again by chance. Now if there is any gift of the gods to men, it is reasonable that happiness should be God-given, and most surely God-given of all human things inasmuch as it is the best. But this question would perhaps be more appropriate to another inquiry. Happiness seems, however, even if it is not God-sent but comes as a result of virtue and some process of learning or training, to be among the most godlike things, for that which is the prize and end of virtue seems to be the best thing in the world, and something godlike and blessed. It will also on this view be very generally shared, for all who are not maimed as regards their potentiality for virtue may win it by a certain kind of study and care. But if it is better to be happy thus than by chance, it is reasonable that the facts should be so, since everything that depends on the action of nature is by nature as good as it can be, and similarly everything that depends on art or any rational cause, and especially if it depends on the best of all causes. To entrust to chance what is greatest and most noble would be a very defective arrangement. The answer to the question we are asking is plain also from the definition of happiness, for it has been said to be a virtuous activity of soul of a certain kind. Of the remaining goods, some must necessarily pre-exist as conditions of happiness, and others are naturally cooperative and useful as instruments. and this will be found to agree with what we said at the outset, for we stated the end of political science to be the best end. And political science spends most of its pains on making the citizens to be of a certain character, viz., good and capable of noble acts. It is natural, then, that we call neither ox nor horse nor any other of the animals happy, for none of them is capable of sharing in such activity. For this reason also a boy is not happy, for he is not yet capable of such acts owing to his age, and boys who are called happy are being congratulated by reason of the hopes we have for them. For there is required, as we said, not only complete virtue, but also a complete life. Since many changes occur in life and all manner of chances, and the most prosperous may fall into great misfortunes in old age, as is told of Priam in the Trojan cycle, and one who has experienced such chances and has ended wretchedly no one calls happy. Must no one at all then be called happy while he lives? Must we, as Solon says, see the end? Even if we are to lay down this doctrine, is it also the case that a man is happy when he is dead? Or is not this quite absurd, especially for us who say that happiness is an activity? But if we do not call the dead man happy, and if Solon does not mean this, but that one can then safely call a man blessed as being at last beyond evils and misfortune. This also affords matter for discussion, for both evil and good are thought to exist for a dead man, as much as for one who is alive but not aware of them, e.g. honors and dishonors and the good or bad fortunes of children, and in general of descendants. And this also presents a problem, for though a man has lived happily up to old age and has had a death worthy of his life, many reverses may befall his descendants. Some of them may be good and attain the life they deserve, while with others the opposite may be the case. And clearly, too, the degrees of relationship between them and their ancestors may vary indefinitely. It would be odd, then, if the dead man were to share in these changes and become at one time happy, at another wretched. While it would also be odd if the fortunes of the descendants did not, for some time, have some effect on the happiness of their ancestors. But we must return to our first difficulty, for perhaps by a consideration of it our present problem might be solved. Now if we must see the end and only then call a man happy, not as being happy but as having been so before, surely this is a paradox, that when he is happy the attribute that belongs to him is not to be truly predicated of him, because we do not wish to call living men happy, on account of the changes that may befall them. And because we have assumed happiness to be something permanent and by no means easily changed, while a single man may suffer many turns of fortune's wheel. For clearly if we were to keep pace with his fortunes, we should often call the same man happy and again wretched, making the happy man out to be chameleon and insecurely based. Or is this keeping pace with his fortunes quite wrong? Success or failure in life does not depend on these, but human life, as we said, needs these as mere additions, while virtuous activities or their opposites are what constitute happiness or the reverse. The question we have now discussed confirms our definition. For no function of man has so much permanence as virtuous activities. These are thought to be more durable even than knowledge of the sciences, and of these themselves the most valuable are more durable because those who are happy spend their life most readily and most continuously in these. For this seems to be the reason why we do not forget them. The attribute in question, then, will belong to the happy man, and he will be happy throughout his life, for always or by preference to everything else, he will be engaged in virtuous action and contemplation, and he will bear the chances of life most nobly and altogether decorously, if he is truly good and foursquare beyond reproach. Now many events happen by chance, and events differing in importance. Small pieces of good fortune or of its opposite clearly do not weigh down the scales of life one way or the other, but a multitude of great events, if they turn out well, will make life happier. For not only are they themselves such as to add beauty to life, but the way a man deals with them may be noble and good, while if they turn out ill they crush and maim happiness. For they both bring pain with them and hinder many activities. Yet even in these nobility shines through, when a man bears with resignation many great misfortunes, not through insensibility to pain, but through nobility and greatness of soul. If activities are, as we said, what gives life its character, no happy man can become miserable, for he will never do the acts that are hateful and mean. For the man who is truly good and wise, we think, bears all the chances life becomingly and always makes the best of circumstances, as a good general makes the best military use of the army at his command, and a good shoemaker makes the best shoes out of the hides that are given him, and so with all other craftsmen. And if this is the case, the happy man can never become miserable, though he will not reach blessedness if he meet with fortunes like those of Priam. Nor again is he many-colored and changeable, for neither will he be moved from his happy state easily or by any ordinary misadventures, but only by many great ones, nor, if he has had many great misadventures, will he recover his happiness in a short time, but if at all, only in a long and complete one in which he has attained many splendid successes. When then should we not say that he is happy who is active in accordance with complete virtue and is sufficiently equipped with external goods, not for some chance period but throughout a complete life? Or must we add, and who is destined to live thus and die as befits his life? Certainly the future is obscure to us, while happiness we claim is an end and something in every way final. If so, we shall call happy those among living men in whom these conditions are and are to be fulfilled. But happy men, so much for these questions. That the fortunes of descendants and of all a man's friends should not affect his happiness at all seems a very unfriendly doctrine, and one opposed to the opinions men hold. But since the events that happen are numerous and admit of all sorts of difference, and some come more near to us and others less so, it seems a long, nay, an infinite task to discuss each in detail. A general outline will perhaps suffice. If then some of a man's own misadventures have a certain weight and influence on life, while others are, as it were, lighter, so too there are differences among the misadventures of our friends taken as a whole. And it makes a difference whether the various suffering befall the living or the dead, much more even than whether lawless and terrible deeds are presupposed in a tragedy or done on the stage. This difference also must be taken into account, or rather, perhaps, the fact that doubt is felt whether the dead share in any good or evil. For it seems from these considerations that even if anything whether good or evil penetrates to them, it must be something weak and negligible, either in itself or for them. Or if not, at least it must be such in degree and kind as not to make happy those who are not happy, nor to take away their blessedness from those who are. The good or bad fortunes of friends, then, seem to have some effects on the dead, but effects of such a kind and degree as neither to make the happy unhappy, nor to produce any other change of the kind. These questions having been definitely answered, let us consider whether happiness is among the things that are praised, or rather among the things that are prized. For clearly it is not to be placed among potentialities. Everything that is praised seems to be praised because it is of a certain kind and is related somehow to something else. For we praise the just or brave man, and in general both the good man and virtue itself, because of the actions and functions involved, and we praise the strong man, the good runner, and so on, because he is of a certain kind and is related in a certain way to something good and important. This is clear also from the praises of the gods, for it seems absurd that the gods should be referred to our standard, but this is done because praise involves a reference to something else. But if praise is for things such as we have described, clearly what applies to the best things is not praise, but something greater and better, as is indeed obvious. For what we do to the gods and the most godlike of men is to call them blessed and happy. And so too with good things, no one praises happiness as he does justice, but rather calls it blessed, as being something more divine and better. Eudoxus also seems to have been right in his method of advocating the supremacy of pleasure. He thought that the fact that, though a good, it is not praised indicated it to be better than the things that are praised, and that this is what God and the good are, for by reference to these all other things are judged. Praise is appropriate to virtue, for as a result of virtue men tend to do noble deeds, but encomia are bestowed on acts, whether of the body or of the soul. But perhaps nicety in these matters is more proper to those who have made a study of encomia. To us it is clear from what has been said that happiness is among the things that are prized and perfect. It seems to be so also from the fact that it is a first principle, for it is for the sake of this that we all do all that we do, and the first principle and cause of goods is, we claim, something prized and divine. Since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness. The true student of politics, too, is thought to have studied virtue above all things, for he wishes to make his fellow citizens good and obedient to the laws. As an example of this, we have the lawgivers of the Cretans and the Spartans, and any others of the kind that there may have been. And if this inquiry belongs to political science, clearly the pursuit of it will be in accordance with our original plan. But clearly the virtue we must study is human virtue, for the good we were seeking was human good, and the happiness human happiness. By human virtue we mean not that of the body, but that of the soul, and happiness also we call an activity of soul. But if this is so, clearly the student of politics must know somehow the facts about soul, as the man who is to heal the eyes or the body as a whole must know about the eyes or the body, and all the more since politics is more prized and better than medicine. But even among doctors the best educated spend much labor on acquiring knowledge of the body. The student of politics, then, must study the soul, and must study it with these objects in view, and do so just to the extent which is sufficient for the questions we are discussing, for further precision is perhaps something more laborious than our purposes require. Some things are said about it adequately enough, even in the discussions outside our school, and we must use these, e.g. that one element in the soul is irrational and one has a rational principle. Whether these are separated as the parts of the body or of anything divisible or are distinct by definition, but by nature inseparable, like convex and concave in the circumference of a circle, does not affect the present question. Of the irrational element, one division seems to be widely distributed and vegetative in its nature. I mean that which causes nutrition and growth, for it is this kind of power of the soul that one must assign to all nurslings and to embryos, and this same power to full-grown creatures. This is more reasonable than to assign some different power to them. Now the excellence of this seems to be common to all species and not specifically human, for this part or faculty seems to function most in sleep, while goodness and badness are least manifest in sleep, whence comes the saying that the happy are not better off than the wretched for half their lives. And this happens naturally enough, since sleep is an inactivity of the soul in that respect in which it is called good or bad. Unless perhaps to a small extent some of the movements actually penetrate to the soul, and in this respect the dreams of good men are better than those of ordinary people. Enough of this subject, however. Let us leave the nutritive faculty alone, since it has by its nature no share in human excellence. There seems to be also another irrational element in the soul, one which in a sense, however, shares an irrational principle. For we praise the rational principle of the continent man and of the incontinent, and the part of their soul that has such a principle, since it urges them aright and towards the best objects. But there is found in them also another element naturally opposed to the rational principle, which fights against and resists that principle. For exactly as paralyzed limbs, when we intend to move them to the right, turn on the contrary to the left, so is it with the soul. The impulses of incontinent people move in contrary directions. But while in the body we see that which moves astray, in the soul we do not. No doubt, however, we must nonetheless suppose that in the soul too there is something contrary to the rational principle, resisting and opposing it. In what sense it is distinct from the other elements does not concern us. Now even this seems to have a share in a rational principle, as we said. At any rate, in the continent man it obeys the rational principle, and presumably in the temperate and brave man it is still more obedient, for in him it speaks on all matters, with the same voice as the rational principle. Therefore the irrational element also appears to be twofold, for the vegetative element in no way shares an irrational principle, but the appetitive and in general the desiring element in a sense shares in it, in so far as it listens to and obeys it. This is the sense in which we speak of taking account of one's father or one's friends, not that in which we speak of accounting for a mathematical property. That the irrational element is in some sense persuaded by a rational principle is indicated also by the giving of advice and by all reproof and exhortation. And if this element also must be said to have a rational principle, that which has a rational principle, as well as that which has not, will be twofold, one subdivision having it in the strict sense and in itself, and the other having a tendency to obey as one does one's father. Virtue too is distinguished into kinds in accordance with this difference. For we say that some of the virtues are intellectual, and others moral, philosophic wisdom and understanding, and practical wisdom being intellectual, liberality and temperance moral. For in speaking about a man's character we do not say that he is wise or has understanding, but that he is good-tempered or temperate, yet we praise the wise man also with respect to his state of mind. And of states of mind we call those which merit praise virtues. Book Roman 2. Virtue then being of two kinds, intellectual and moral. Intellectual virtue in the main owes both its birth and its growth to teaching, for which reason it requires experience and time, while moral virtue comes about as a result of habit, whence also its name ethic is one that is formed by a slight variation from the word ethos, habit. From this it is also plain that none of the moral virtues arises in us by nature. For nothing that exists by nature can form a habit contrary to its nature. For instance, the stone which by nature moves downwards cannot be habituated to move upwards, not even if one tries to train it by throwing it up 10,000 times. Nor can fire be habituated to move downwards, nor can anything else that by nature behaves in one way be trained to behave in another. Neither by nature, then, nor contrary to nature do the virtues arise in us. Rather, we are adapted by nature to receive them, and are made perfect by habit. Again, of all the things that come to us by nature, we first acquire the potentiality and later exhibit the activity. This is plain in the case of the senses. For it was not by often seeing or often hearing that we got these senses, but on the contrary we had them before we used them, and did not come to have them by using them. But the virtues we get by first exercising them, as also happens in the case of the arts as well. For the things we have to learn before we can do them. We learn by doing them, e.g. men become builders by building and lyre players by playing the lyre. So too we become just by doing just acts, temperate by doing temperate acts, brave by doing brave acts. This is confirmed by what happens in states, for legislators make the citizens good by forming habits in them, and this is the wish of every legislator, and those who do not effect it miss their mark, and it is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. Again, it is from the same causes and by the same means that every virtue is both produced and destroyed, and similarly every art, for it is from playing the lyre that both good and bad lyre players are produced. And the corresponding statement is true of builders and of all the rest. Men will be good or bad builders as a result of building well or badly. For if this were not so, there would have been no need of a teacher, but all men would have been born good or bad at their craft. This then is the case with the virtues also. By doing the acts that we do in our transactions with other men, we become just or unjust, and by doing the acts that we do in the presence of danger, and being habituated to feel fear or confidence, we become brave or cowardly. The same is true of appetites and feelings of anger. Some men become temperate and good-tempered, others self-indulgent and irascible, by behaving in one way or the other in the appropriate circumstances. Thus, in one word, states of character arise out of like activities. This is why the activities we exhibit must be of a certain kind. It is because the states of character correspond to the differences between these. It makes no small difference, then, whether we form habits of one kind or of another from our very youth. It makes a very great difference, or rather all the difference. Since then, the present inquiry does not aim at theoretical knowledge like the others, for we are inquiring not in order to know what virtue is, but in order to become good, since otherwise our inquiry would have been of no use. We must examine the nature of actions, namely how we ought to do them, for these determine also the nature of the states of character that are produced, as we have said. Now, that we must act according to the right rule is a common principle and must be assumed. It will be discussed later, i.e., both what the right rule is and how it is related to the other virtues. But this must be agreed upon beforehand, that the whole account of matters of conduct must be given in outline and not precisely, as we said at the very beginning that the accounts we demand must be in accordance with the subject matter. Matters concerned with conduct and questions of what is good for us have no fixity, any more than matters of health. The general account being of this nature, the account of particular cases is yet more lacking in exactness. For they do not fall under any art or precept, but the agents themselves must in each case consider what is appropriate to the occasion, as happens also in the art of medicine or of navigation. But though our present account is of this nature, we must give what help we can. First then let us consider this, that it is the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and of health. For to gain light on things imperceptible, we must use the evidence of sensible things. Both excessive and defective exercise destroys the strength, and similarly drink or food which is above or below a certain amount destroys the health. While that which is proportionate both produces and increases and preserves it, so too is it, then, in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. For the man who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground against anything becomes a coward, and the man who fears nothing at all but goes to meet every danger becomes rash. And similarly the man who indulges in every pleasure and abstains from none becomes self-indulgent, while the man who shuns every pleasure, as boors do, becomes in a way insensible. Temperance and courage, then, are destroyed by excess and defect, and preserved by the mean. But not only are the sources and causes of their origination and growth the same as those of their destruction, but also the sphere of their actualization will be the same. For this is also true of the things which are more evident to sense, e.g. of strength. It is produced by taking much food and undergoing much exertion, and it is the strong man that will be most able to do these things. So too is it with the virtues. By abstaining from pleasures we become temperate. And it is when we have become so that we are most able to abstain from them, and similarly too in the case of courage. For by being habituated to despise things that are terrible and to stand our ground against them, we become brave, and it is when we have become so that we shall be most able to stand our ground against them. We must take as a sign of states of character the pleasure or pain that ensues on acts. For the man who abstains from bodily pleasures and delights in this very fact is temperate, while the man who is annoyed at it is self-indulgent, and he who stands his ground against things that are terrible and delights in this, or at least is not pained, is brave, while the man who is pained is a coward. For moral excellence is concerned with pleasures and pains. It is on account of the pleasure that we do bad things, and on account of the pain that we abstain from noble ones. Hence we ought to have been brought up in a particular way from our very youth, as Plato says, so as both to delight in and to be pained by the things that we ought, for this is the right education. Again, if the virtues are concerned with actions and passions, and every passion and every action is accompanied by pleasure and pain, for this reason also virtue will be concerned with pleasures and pains. This is indicated also by the fact that punishment is inflicted by these means, for it is a kind of cure, and it is the nature of cures to be affected by contraries. Again, as we said but lately, every state of soul has a nature relative to and concerned with the kind of things by which it tends to be made worse or better. But it is by reason of pleasures and pains that men become bad, by pursuing and avoiding these either the pleasures and pains they ought not, or when they ought not, or as they ought not, or by going wrong in one of the other similar ways that may be distinguished. Hence men even define the virtues as certain states of impassivity and rest, not well, however, because they speak absolutely, and do not say as one ought and as one ought not, and when one ought or ought not, and the other things that may be added. We assume, then, that this kind of excellence tends to do what is best with regard to pleasures and pains, and vice does the contrary. The following facts also may show us that virtue and vice are concerned with these same things. There being 3 objects of choice and 3 of avoidance, the noble, the advantageous, the pleasant and their contraries, the base, the injurious, the painful, about all of these the good man tends to go right and the bad man to go wrong, and especially about pleasure. For this is common to the animals, and also it accompanies all objects of choice. For even the noble and the advantageous appear pleasant. Again, it has grown up with us all from our infancy. This is why it is difficult to rub off this passion, ingrained as it is in our life, and we measure even our actions, some of us more and others less, by the rule of pleasure and pain. For this reason, then, our whole inquiry must be about these, for to feel delight and pain rightly or wrongly has no small effect on our actions. Again, it is harder to fight with pleasure than with anger, to use Heraclitus' phrase, but both art and virtue are always concerned with what is harder, for even the good is better when it is harder. Therefore, for this reason also the whole concern both of virtue and of political science is with pleasures and pains, for the man who uses these well will be good, he who uses them badly bad. That virtue then is concerned with pleasures and pains, and that by the acts from which it arises it is both increased and, if they are done differently, destroyed, and that the acts from which it arose are those in which it actualizes itself. Let this be taken as said. The question might be asked, what we mean by saying that we must become just by doing just acts and temperate by doing temperate acts. For if men do just and temperate acts, they are already just and temperate, exactly as, if they do what is in accordance with the laws of grammar and of music, they are grammarians and musicians. Or is this not true even of the arts? It is possible to do something that is in accordance with the laws of grammar, either by chance or at the suggestion of another. A man will be a grammarian, then, only when he has both done something grammatical and done it grammatically, and this means doing it in accordance with the grammatical knowledge in himself. Again, the case of the arts and that of the virtues are not similar, for the products of the arts have their goodness in themselves, so that it is enough that they should have a certain character, but if the acts that are in accordance with the virtues have themselves a certain character, it does not follow that they are done justly or temperately. The agent also must be in a certain condition when he does them. In the first place he must have knowledge, secondly he must choose the acts, and choose them for their own sakes, and thirdly his action must proceed from a firm and unchangeable character. These are not reckoned in as conditions of the possession of the arts, except the bare knowledge, but as a condition of the possession of the virtues knowledge has little or no weight, while the other conditions count not for little but for everything, i.e., the very conditions which result from often doing just and temperate acts. Actions then are called just and temperate when they are such as the just or the temperate man would do, but it is not the man who does these that is just and temperate, but the man who also does them as just and temperate men do them. It is well said then that it is by doing just acts that the just man is produced, and by doing temperate acts the temperate man. Without doing these, no one would have even a prospect of becoming good. But most people do not do these, but take refuge in theory and think they are being philosophers and will become good in this way, behaving somewhat like patients who listen attentively to their doctors, but do none of the things they are ordered to do. As the latter will not be made well in body by such a course of treatment, the former will not be made well in soul by such a course of philosophy. Next we must consider what virtue is. Since things that are found in the soul are of 3 kinds: passions, faculties, states of character, virtue must be one of these. By passions I mean appetite, anger, fear, confidence, envy, joy, friendly feeling, hatred, longing, emulation, pity, and in general the feelings that are accompanied by pleasure or pain. By faculties the things in virtue of which we are said to be capable of feeling these, e.g., of becoming angry or being pained or feeling pity. By states of character the things in virtue of which we stand well or badly with reference to the passions, e.g. with reference to anger we stand badly if we feel it violently or too weakly, and well if we feel it moderately, and similarly with reference to the other passions. Now neither the virtues nor the vices are passions, because we are not called good or bad on the ground of our passions, but are so called on the ground of our virtues and our vices, and because we are neither praised nor blamed for our passions, for the man who feels fear or anger is not praised, nor is the man who simply feels anger blamed, but the man who feels it in a certain way, but for our virtues and our vices we are praised or blamed. Again, we feel anger and fear without choice, but the virtues are modes of choice or involve choice. Further, in respect of the passions we are said to be moved, but in respect of the virtues and the vices we are said not to be moved, but to be disposed in a particular way. For these reasons also they are not faculties, for we are neither called good nor bad, nor praised nor blamed for the simple capacity of feeling the passions. Again, we have the faculties by nature, but we are not made good or bad by nature. We have spoken of this before. If then the virtues are neither passions nor faculties, all that remains is that they should be states of character. Thus we have stated what virtue is in respect of its genus. We must, however, not only describe virtue as a state of character, but also say what sort of state it is. We may remark, then, that every virtue or excellence both brings into good condition the thing of which it is the excellence and makes the work of that thing be done well. E.g., the excellence of the eye makes both the eye and its work good, for it is by the excellence of the eye that we see well. Similarly, the excellence of the horse makes a horse both good in itself and good at running, and at carrying its rider, and at awaiting the attack of the enemy. Therefore, if this is true in every case, the virtue of man also will be the state of character which makes a man good, and which makes him do his own work well. How this is to happen we have stated already, but it will be made plain also by the following consideration of the specific nature of virtue. In everything that is continuous and divisible, it is possible to take more or less or an equal amount, and that either in terms of the thing itself or relatively to us, and the equal is an intermediate between excess and defect. By the intermediate in the object I mean that which is equidistant from each of the extremes, which is one and the same for all men. By the intermediate relatively to us that which is neither too much nor too little, and this is not one nor the same for all. For instance, if 10 is many and 2 is few, 6 is the intermediate taken in terms of the object, for it exceeds and is exceeded by an equal amount. This is intermediate according to arithmetical proportion. But the intermediate relatively to us is not to be taken so. If 10 pounds are too much for a particular person to eat and 2 too little, it does not follow that the trainer will order 6 pounds, for this also is perhaps too much for the person who is to take it, or too little for Milo, too much for the beginner in athletic exercises. The same is true of running and wrestling. Thus a master of any art avoids excess and defect, but seeks the intermediate and chooses this the intermediate not in the object but relatively to us. If it is thus then that every art does its work well by looking to the intermediate and judging its works by this standard, so that we often say of good works of art that it is not possible either to take away or to add anything, implying that excess and defect destroy the goodness of works of art, while the mean preserves it. And good artists, as we say, look to this in their work, and if further virtue is more exact and better than any art, as nature also is, then virtue must have the quality of aiming at the intermediate, I mean moral virtue, for it is this that is concerned with passions and actions, and in these there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. For instance, both fear and confidence and appetite and anger and pity and in general pleasure and pain may be felt both too much and too little, and in both cases not well. But to feel them at the right times, with reference to the right objects, towards the right people, with the right motive, and in the right way is what is both intermediate and best, and this is characteristic of virtue. Similarly, with regard to actions also there is excess, defect, and the intermediate. Now virtue is concerned with passions and actions, in which excess is a form of failure, and so is defect, while the intermediate is praised and is a form of success, and being praised and being successful are both characteristics of virtue. Therefore virtue is a kind of mean, since, as we have seen, it aims at what is intermediate. Again, it is possible to fail in many ways, for evil belongs to the class of the unlimited, as the Pythagoreans conjectured, and good to that of the limited, while to succeed is possible only in one way, for which reason also one is easy and the other difficult, to miss the mark easy, to hit it difficult. For these reasons also, then, excess and defect are characteristic of vice, and the mean of virtue. For men are good in but one way, but bad in many. Virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, i.e., the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it. Now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. And again it is a mean because the vices respectively fall short of or exceed what is right in both passions and actions, while virtue both finds and chooses that which is intermediate. Hence, in respect of its substance and the definition which states its essence, virtue is a mean, with regard to what is best and right and extreme. But not every action nor every passion admits of a mean, for some have names that already imply badness, e.g. spite, shamelessness, envy, and in the case of actions adultery, theft, murder. For all of these and such like things imply by their names that they are themselves bad and not the excesses or deficiencies of them. It is not possible, then, ever to be right with regard to them. One must always be wrong. Nor does goodness or badness with regard to such things depend on committing adultery with the right woman, at the right time, and in the right way, but simply to do any of them is to go wrong. It would be equally absurd, then, to expect that in unjust, cowardly, and voluptuous action there should be a mean, an excess, and a deficiency. For at that rate there would be a mean of excess and of deficiency, an excess of excess, and a deficiency of deficiency. But as there is no excess and deficiency of temperance and courage, because what is intermediate is, in a sense, an extreme, so too of the actions we have mentioned there is no mean nor any excess and deficiency. But however they are done they are wrong, for in general there is neither a mean of excess and deficiency, nor excess and deficiency of a mean. We must, however, not only make this general statement, but also apply it to the individual facts. For among statements about conduct those which are general apply more widely, but those which are particular are more genuine, since conduct has to do with individual cases, and our statements must harmonize with the facts in these cases. We may take these cases from our table. With regard to feelings of fear and confidence, courage is the mean. Of the people who exceed, he who exceeds in fearlessness has no name, many of the states have no name, while the man who exceeds in confidence is rash, and he who exceeds in fear and falls short in confidence is a coward. With regard to pleasures and pains, not all of them, and not so much with regard to the pains, the mean is temperance, the excess self-indulgence. Persons deficient with regard to the pleasures are not often found, hence such persons also have received no name, but let us call them insensible. With regard to giving and taking of money, the mean is liberality, the excess, and the defect prodigality and meanness. In these actions people exceed and fall short in contrary ways. The prodigal exceeds in spending and falls short in taking, while the mean man exceeds in taking and falls short in spending. At present we are giving a mere outline or summary, and are satisfied with this. Later these states will be more exactly determined. With regard to money, there are also other dispositions, a mean, magnificence, for the magnificent man differs from the liberal man. The former deals with large sums, the latter with small ones, an excess, tastelessness, and vulgarity, and a deficiency, niggardliness. These differ from the states opposed to liberality, and the mode of their difference will be stated later. With regard to honor and dishonor, the mean is proper pride, the excess is known as a sort of empty vanity, and the deficiency is undue humility. And as we said, liberality was related to magnificence, differing from it by dealing with small sums, so there is a state similarly related to proper pride, being concerned with small honors while that is concerned with great. For it is possible to desire honor as one ought, and more than one ought, and less. And the man who exceeds in his desires is called ambitious, the man who falls short unambitious, while the intermediate person has no name. The dispositions also are nameless, except that of the ambitious man is called ambition. Hence the people who are at the extremes lay claim to the middle place, and we ourselves sometimes call the intermediate person ambitious and sometimes unambitious, and sometimes praise the ambitious man and sometimes the unambitious. The reason of our doing this will be stated in what follows, but now let us speak of the remaining states according to the method which has been indicated. With regard to anger also, there is an excess, a deficiency, and a mean. Although they can scarcely be said to have names, yet since we call the intermediate person good-tempered, let us call the mean good temper. Of the persons at the extremes, let the one who exceeds be called irascible, and his vice irascibility, and the man who falls short an irascible sort of person, and the deficiency in irascibility. There are also 3 other means which have a certain likeness to one another, but differ from one another. For they are all concerned with intercourse in words and actions, but differ in that one is concerned with truth in this sphere, the other 2 with pleasantness. And of this one kind is exhibited in giving amusement, the other in all the circumstances of life. We must therefore speak of these 2, that we may the better see that in all things the mean is praiseworthy, and the extremes neither praiseworthy nor right, but worthy of blame. Now most of these states also have no names, but we must try, as in the other cases, to invent names ourselves, so that we may be clear and easy to follow. With regard to truth, then, the intermediate is a truthful sort of person, and the mean may be called truthfulness, while the pretense which exaggerates is boastfulness, and the person characterized by it a boaster, and that which understates is mock modesty, and the person characterized by it mock modest. With regard to pleasantness in the giving of amusement, the intermediate person is ready-witted, and the disposition ready-wit. The excess is buffoonary, and the person characterized by it a buffoon, while the man who falls short is a sort of boor, and his state is boorishness. With regard to the remaining kind of pleasantness, that which is exhibited in life in general, the man who is pleasant in the right way is friendly, and the mean is friendliness, while the man who exceeds is an obsequious person if he has no end in view, a flatterer if he is aiming at his own advantage, and the man who falls short and is unpleasant in all circumstances is a quarrelsome and surly sort of person. There are also means in the passions and concerned with the passions, since shame is not a virtue, and yet praise is extended to the modest man. For even in these matters one man is said to be intermediate and another to exceed, as for instance the bashful man who is ashamed of everything, while he who falls short or is not ashamed of anything at all is shameless, and the intermediate person is modest. Righteous indignation is a mean between envy and spite. And these states are concerned with the pain and pleasure that are felt at the fortunes of our neighbors. The man who is characterized by righteous indignation is pained at undeserved good fortune. The envious man, going beyond him, is pained at all good fortune, and the spiteful man falls so far short of being pained that he even rejoices. But these states there will be an opportunity of describing elsewhere. With regard to justice, since it has not one simple meaning, we shall, after describing the other states, distinguish its two kinds and say how each of them is a mean, and similarly we shall treat also of the rational virtues. There are three kinds of disposition, then, two of them vices, involving excess and deficiency respectively, and one a virtue, viz. The mean and all are in a sense opposed to all, for the extreme states are contrary both to the intermediate state and to each other, and the intermediate to the extremes. As the equal is greater relatively to the less, less relatively to the greater, so the middle states are excessive relatively to the deficiencies, deficient relatively to the excesses, both in passions and in actions. For the brave man appears rash relatively to the coward, and cowardly relatively to the rash man. And similarly the temperate man appears self-indulgent relatively to the insensible man, insensible relatively to the self-indulgent, and the liberal man prodigal relatively to the mean man, mean relatively to the prodigal. Hence also the people at the extremes push the intermediate man each over to the other, and the brave man is called rash by the coward, cowardly by the rash man, and correspondingly in the other cases. These states being thus opposed to one another, the greatest contrariety is that of the extremes to each other, rather than to the intermediate, for these are further from each other than from the intermediate, as the great is further from the small, and the small from the great than both are from the equal. Again, to the intermediate some extremes show a certain likeness, as that of rashness to courage and that of prodigality to liberality, but the extremes show the greatest unlikeness to each other. Now contraries are defined as the things that are furthest from each other, so that things that are further apart are more contrary. To the mean in some cases the deficiency, in some the excess is more opposed, e.g. it is not rashness which is an excess, but cowardice which is a deficiency that is more opposed to courage, and not insensibility which is a deficiency, but self-indulgence which is an excess that is more opposed to temperance. This happens from two reasons, one being drawn from the thing itself, for because one extreme is nearer and liker to the intermediate. We oppose not this, but rather its contrary to the intermediate, e.g., since rashness is thought liker and nearer to courage, and cowardice more unlike, we oppose rather the latter to courage, for things that are further from the intermediate are thought more contrary to it. This then is one cause drawn from the thing itself, another is drawn from ourselves, for the things to which we ourselves more naturally tend seem more contrary to the intermediate. For instance, we ourselves tend more naturally to pleasures, and hence are more easily carried away towards self-indulgence than towards propriety. We describe as contrary to the mean, then, rather the directions in which we more often go to great lengths, and therefore self-indulgence, which is an excess, is the more contrary to temperance. That moral virtue is a mean, then, and in what sense it is so, and that it is a mean between two vices, the one involving excess, the other deficiency, and that it is such because its character is to aim at what is intermediate in passions and in actions, has been sufficiently stated. Hence also it is no easy task to be good. For in everything it is no easy task to find the middle, e.g., to find the middle of a circle is not for everyone but for him who knows so. 2. Anyone can get angry, that is easy, or give or spend money, but to do this to the right person, to the right extent, at the right time, with the right motive, and in the right way, that is not for everyone, nor is it easy, wherefore goodness is both rare and laudable and noble. Hence he who aims at the intermediate must first depart from what is the more contrary to it, as Calypso advises. Hold the ship out beyond that surf and spray. For of the extremes one is more erroneous, one less so. Therefore, since to hit the mean is hard in the extreme, we must as a second best, as people say, take the least of the evils, and this will be done best in the way we describe. But we must consider the things towards which we ourselves also are easily carried away, for some of us tend to one thing, some to another, and this will be recognizable from the pleasure and the pain we feel. We must drag ourselves away to the contrary extreme, for we shall get into the intermediate state by drawing well away from error, as people do in straightening sticks that are bent. Now in everything the pleasant or pleasure is most to be guarded against, for we do not judge it impartially. We ought then to feel towards pleasure as the elders of the people felt towards Helen, and in all circumstances repeat their saying, for if we dismiss pleasure thus we are less likely to go astray. It is by doing this then, to sum the matter up, that we shall best be able to hit the mean. But this is no doubt difficult, and especially in individual cases, for it is not easy to determine both how and with whom and on what provocation and how long one should be angry. For we too sometimes praise those who fall short and call them good-tempered, but sometimes we praise those who get angry and call them manly. The man, however, who deviates little from goodness is not blamed, whether he do so in the direction of the more or of the less. But only the man who deviates more widely, for he does not fail to be noticed. But up to what point and to what extent a man must deviate before he becomes blameworthy, it is not easy to determine by reasoning, any more than anything else that is perceived by the senses. Such things depend on particular facts, and the decision rests with perception. So much then is plain that the intermediate state is in all things to be praised, but that we must incline sometimes towards the excess, sometimes towards the deficiency, for so shall we most easily hit the mean and what is right. Book Romans 3. Since virtue is concerned with passions and actions, and on voluntary passions and actions praise and blame are bestowed, on those that are involuntary pardon and sometimes also pity, to distinguish the voluntary and the involuntary is presumably necessary for those who are studying the nature of virtue, and useful also for legislators with a view to the assigning both of honors and of punishments. Those things, then, are thought involuntary, which take place under compulsion or owing to ignorance, and that is compulsory of which the moving principle is outside, being a principle in which nothing is contributed by the person who is acting or is feeling the passion, e.g., if he were to be carried somewhere by a wind, or by men who had him in their power. But with regard to the things that are done from fear of greater evils, or for some noble object, e.g., if a tyrant were to order one to do something base, having one's parents and children in his power, and if one did the action they were to be saved, but otherwise would be put to death, it may be debated whether such actions are involuntary or voluntary. Something of the sort happens also with regard to the throwing of goods overboard in a storm. For in the abstract no one throws goods away voluntarily, but on condition of its securing the safety of himself and his crew. Any sensible man does so. Such actions, then, are mixed, but are more like voluntary actions, for they are worthy of choice at the time when they are done, and the end of an action is relative to the occasion. Both the terms, then, voluntary and involuntary, must be used with reference to the moment of action. Now the man acts voluntarily, for the principle that moves the instrumental parts of the body in such actions is in him, and the things of which the moving principle is in a man himself are in his power to do or not to do. Such actions, therefore, are voluntary, but in the abstract perhaps involuntary, for no one would choose any such act in itself. For such actions men are sometimes even praised, when they endure something base or painful in return for great and noble objects gained. In the opposite case they are blamed, since to endure the greatest indignities for no noble end or for trifling end is the mark of an inferior person. On some actions praise indeed is not bestowed, but pardon is, when one does what he ought not under pressure which overstrains human nature, and which no one could withstand. But some acts perhaps we cannot be forced to do, but ought rather to face death after the most fearful sufferings, for the things that forced Euripides Alcmaeon to slay his mother seem absurd. It is difficult sometimes to determine what should be chosen at what cost, and what should be endured in return for what gain, and yet more difficult to abide by our decisions. For as a rule what is expected is painful, and what we are forced to do is base, whence praise and blame are bestowed on those who have been compelled or have not. What sort of acts then should be called compulsory? We answer that without qualification actions are so when the cause is in the external circumstances and the agent contributes nothing. But the things that in themselves are involuntary, but now and in return for these gains are worthy of choice, and whose moving principle is in the agent, are in themselves involuntary, but now and in return for these gains voluntary. They are more like voluntary acts. For actions are in the class of particulars, and the particular acts here are voluntary. What sort of things are to be chosen, and in return for what, it is not easy to state, for there are many differences in the particular cases. But if someone were to say that pleasant and noble objects have a compelling power, forcing us from without, all acts would be for him compulsory, for it is for these objects that all men do everything they do. And those who act under compulsion and unwillingly act with pain, but those who do acts for their pleasantness and nobility do them with pleasure. It is absurd to make external circumstances responsible, and not oneself, as being easily caught by such attractions. And to make oneself responsible for noble acts, but the pleasant objects responsible for base acts. The compulsory, then, seems to be that whose moving principle is outside, the person compelled contributing nothing. Everything that is done by reason of ignorance is not voluntary. It is only what produces pain and repentance that is involuntary. For the man who has done something owing to ignorance and feels not the least vexation at his action has not acted voluntarily, since he did not know what he was doing, nor yet involuntarily, since he is not pained. Of people, then, who act by reason of ignorance, he who repents is thought an involuntary agent. And the man who does not repent may, since he is different, be called a not voluntary agent, for, since he differs from the other, it is better that he should have a name of his own. Acting by reason of ignorance seems also to be different from acting in ignorance, for the man who is drunk or in a rage is thought to act as a result not of ignorance, but of one of the causes mentioned, yet not knowingly but in ignorance. Now every wicked man is ignorant of what he ought to do and what he ought to abstain from, and it is by reason of error of this kind that men become unjust and in general bad. But the term involuntary tends to be used not if a man is ignorant of what is to his advantage, for it is not mistaken purpose that causes involuntary action. It leads rather to wickedness, nor ignorance of the universal, for that men are blamed, but ignorance of particulars, i.e., of the circumstances of the action and the objects with which it is concerned. For it is on these that both pity and pardon depend, since the person who is ignorant of any of these acts involuntarily. Perhaps it is just as well, therefore, to determine their nature and number. A man may be ignorant then of who he is, what he is doing, what or whom he is acting on, and sometimes also what, e.g., what instrument he is doing it with and to what end, e.g., he may think his act will conduce to someone's safety, and how he is doing it, e.g., whether gently or violently. Now of all of these no one could be ignorant unless he were mad. And evidently also he could not be ignorant of the agent, for how could he not know himself? But of what he is doing a man might be ignorant, as for instance people say it slipped out of their mouths as they were speaking, or they did not know it was a secret, as Aeschylus said of the mysteries, or a man might say he let it go off when he merely wanted to show its working, as the man did with the catapult. Again, one might think one's son was an enemy, as Merope did, or that a pointed spear had a button on it, or that a stone was pumice stone. Or one might give a man a draught to save him and really kill him, or one might want to touch a man, as people do in sparring, and really wound him. The ignorance may relate, then, to any of these things, i.e., of the circumstances of the action, and the man who was ignorant of any of these is thought to have acted involuntarily, and especially if he was ignorant on the most important points, and these are thought to be the circumstances of the action and its end. Further, the doing of an act that is called involuntary in virtue of ignorance of this sort must be painful and involve repentance. Since that which is done under compulsion or by reason of ignorance is involuntary, the voluntary would seem to be that of which the moving principle is in the agent himself, he being aware of the particular circumstances of the action. Presumably acts done by reason of anger or appetite are not rightly called involuntary. For in the first place, on that showing none of the other animals will act voluntarily, nor will children, and secondly, is it meant that we do not do voluntarily any of the acts that are due to appetite or anger, or that we do the noble acts voluntarily, and the base acts involuntarily? Is not this absurd, when one and the same thing is the cause? But it would surely be odd to describe as involuntary the things one ought to desire, and we ought both to be angry at certain things and to have an appetite for certain things, e.g. for health and for learning. Also, what is involuntary is thought to be painful, but what is in accordance with appetite is thought to be pleasant. Again, what is the difference in respect of involuntariness between errors committed upon calculation and those committed in anger? Both are to be avoided. But the irrational passions are thought not less human than reason is, and therefore also the actions which proceed from anger or appetite are the man's actions. It would be odd, then, to treat them as involuntary. Both the voluntary and the involuntary having been delimited, we must next discuss choice, for it is thought to be most closely bound up with virtue and to discriminate characters better than actions do. Choice then seems to be voluntary, but not the same thing as the voluntary. The latter extends more widely. For both children and the lower animals share in voluntary action, but not in choice, and acts done on the spur of the moment we describe as voluntary, but not as chosen. Those who say it is appetite or anger or wish or a kind of opinion do not seem to be right, for choice is not common to irrational creatures as well, but appetite and anger are. Again, the incontinent man acts with appetite but not with choice, while the continent man on the contrary acts with choice but not with appetite. Again, appetite is contrary to choice but not appetite to appetite. Again, appetite relates to the pleasant and the painful. Choice neither to the painful nor to the pleasant. Still less is it anger, for acts due to anger are thought to be less than any others objects of choice. But neither is it wish, though it seems near to it, for choice cannot relate to impossibles, and if anyone said he chose them he would be thought silly. But there may be a wish even for impossibles, e.g. for immortality. And wish may relate to things that could in no way be brought about by one's own efforts, e.g. that a particular actor or athlete should win in a competition, but no one chooses such things, but only the things that he thinks could be brought about by his own efforts. Again, wish relates rather to the end, choice to the means. For instance, we wish to be healthy, but we choose the acts which will make us healthy, and we wish to be happy and say we do, but we cannot well say we choose to be so. For in general, choice seems to relate to the things that are in our own power. For this reason, too, it cannot be opinion, for opinion is thought to relate to all kinds of things, no less to eternal things and impossible things than to things in our own power, and it is distinguished by its falsity or truth, not by its badness or goodness, while choice is distinguished rather by these. Now with opinion in general, perhaps no one even says it is identical, but it is not identical even with any kind of opinion, for by choosing what is good or bad we are men of a certain character, which we are not by holding certain opinions. And we choose to get or avoid something good or bad, but we have opinions about what a thing is, or whom it is good for, or how it is good for him. We can hardly be said to opine to get or avoid anything. And choice is praised for being related to the right object, rather than for being rightly related to it, opinion for being truly related to its object. And we choose what we best know to be good, but we opine what we do not quite know. And it is not the same people that are thought to make the best choices and to have the best opinions, but some are thought to have fairly good opinions, but by reason of vice to choose what they should not. If opinion precedes choice or accompanies it, that makes no difference, for it is not this that we are considering, but whether it is identical with some kind of opinion. What then, or what kind of thing is it, since it is none of the things we have mentioned? It seems to be voluntary, but not all that is voluntary to be an object of choice. Is it, then, what has been decided on by previous deliberation? At any rate, choice involves a rational principle and thought. Even the name seems to suggest that it is what is chosen before other things. Do we deliberate about everything, and is everything a possible subject of deliberation, or is deliberation impossible about some things? We ought presumably to call not what a fool or a madman would deliberate about, but what a sensible man would deliberate about, a subject of deliberation. Now about eternal things no one deliberates, e.g. about the material universe, or the incommensurability of the diagonal and the side of a square. But no more do we deliberate about the things that involve movement but always happen in the same way, whether of necessity or by nature or from any other cause, e.g. the solstices and the risings of the stars, nor about things that happen now in one way, now in another, e.g. droughts and rains, nor about chance events like the finding of treasure. But we do not deliberate even about all human affairs. For instance, no Spartan deliberates about the best constitution for the Scythians, for none of these things can be brought about by our own efforts. We deliberate about things that are in our power and can be done, and these are in fact what is left. For nature, necessity, and chance are thought to be causes, and also reason and everything that depends on man. Now every class of men deliberates about the things that can be done by their own efforts, and in the case of exact and self-contained sciences there is no deliberation, e.g. about the letters of the alphabet, for we have no doubt how they should be written. But the things that are brought about by our own efforts, but not always in the same way, are the things about which we deliberate, e.g. questions of medical treatment or of money-making. And we do so more in the case of the art of navigation than in that of gymnastics, inasmuch as it has been less exactly worked out, and again about other things in the same ratio, and more also in the case of the arts than in that of the sciences, for we have more doubt about the former. Deliberation is concerned with things that happen in a certain way for the most part, but in which the event is obscure, and with things in which it is indeterminate. We call in others to aid us in deliberation on important questions, distrusting ourselves as not being equal to deciding. We deliberate not about ends but about means. For a doctor does not deliberate whether he shall heal, nor an orator whether he shall persuade, nor a statesman whether he shall produce law and order, nor does anyone else deliberate about his end. They assume the end and consider how and by what means it is to be attained, and if it seems to be produced by several means they consider by which it is most easily and best produced. While if it is achieved by one only they consider how it will be achieved by this, and by what means this will be achieved, till they come to the first cause, which in the order of discovery is last. For the person who deliberates seems to investigate and analyze in the way described, as though he were analyzing a geometrical construction. Not all investigation appears to be deliberation, for instance mathematical investigations, but all deliberation is investigation, and what is last in the order of analysis seems to be first in the order of becoming. And if we come on an impossibility, we give up the search, e.g., if we need money and this cannot be got. But if a thing appears possible, we try to do it. By possible things, I mean things that might be brought about by our own efforts, and these in a sense include things that can be brought about by the efforts of our friends, since the moving principle is in ourselves. The subject of investigation is sometimes the instrument, sometimes the use of them, and similarly in the other cases sometimes the means, sometimes the mode of using it or the means of bringing it about. It seems then, as has been said, that man is a moving principle of actions, Now deliberation is about the things to be done by the agent himself, and actions are for the sake of things other than themselves. For the end cannot be a subject of deliberation, but only the means. Nor indeed can the particular facts be a subject of it, as whether this is bread or has been baked as it should, for these are matters of perception. If we are to be always deliberating, we shall have to go on to infinity. The same thing is deliberated upon and is chosen, except that the object of choice is already determinate, since it is that which has been decided upon as a result of deliberation that is the object of choice. For everyone ceases to inquire how he is to act when he has brought the moving principle back to himself and to the ruling part of himself, for this is what chooses. This is plain also from the ancient constitutions, which Homer represented. For the kings announced their choices to the people. The object of choice being one of the things in our own power which is desired after deliberation, choice will be deliberate desire of things in our own power, for when we have decided as a result of deliberation, we desire in accordance with our deliberation. We may take it, then, that we have described choice in outline, and stated the nature of its objects and the fact that it is concerned with means. That wish is for the end has already been stated. Some think it is for the good, others for the apparent good. Now those who say that the good is the object of wish must admit in consequence that that which the man who does not choose aright wishes for is not an object of wish, for if it is to be so, it must also be good, but it was, if it so happened, bad. While those who say the apparent good is the object of wish must admit that there is no natural object of wish, but only what seems good to each man. Now different things appear good to different people, and if it so happens, even contrary things. If these consequences are unpleasing, are we to say that absolutely and in truth the good is the object of wish, but for each person the apparent good, that that which is in truth an object of wish is an object of wish to the good man, while any chance thing may be so the bad man? As in the case of bodies, also the things that are in truth wholesome are wholesome for bodies which are in good condition. While for those that are diseased other things are wholesome or bitter or sweet or hot or heavy, and so on, since the good man judges each class of things rightly, and in each the truth appears to him. For each state of character has its own ideas of the noble and the pleasant, and perhaps the good man differs from others most by seeing the truth in each class of things, being as it were the norm and measure of them. In most things the error seems to be due to pleasure, for it appears a good when it is not. We therefore choose the pleasant as a good, and avoid pain as an evil. The end then being what we wish for, the means what we deliberate about and choose, actions concerning means must be according to choice and voluntary. Now the exercise of the virtues is concerned with means. Therefore virtue also is in our own power, and so too vice. For where it is in our power to act, it is also in our power not to act, and vice versa, so that if to act where this is noble is in our power, not to act which will be base will also be in our power, and if not to act where this is noble is in our power, to act which will be base will also be in our power. Now if it is in our power to do noble or base acts, and likewise in our power not to do them, and this was what being good or bad meant, then it is in our power to be virtuous or vicious. The saying that no one is voluntarily wicked nor involuntarily happy seems to be partly false and partly true, for no one is involuntarily happy, but wickedness is voluntary. Or else we shall have to dispute what has just been said at any rate, and deny that man is a moving principle or begetter of his actions as of children. But if these facts are evident, and we cannot refer actions to moving principles other than those in ourselves, the acts whose moving principles are in us must themselves also be in our power and voluntary. Witness seems to be borne to this both by individuals in their private capacity and by legislators themselves, for these punish and take vengeance on those who do wicked acts unless they have acted under compulsion or as a result of ignorance for which they are not themselves responsible, while they honor those who do noble acts as though they meant to encourage the latter and deter the former. But no one is encouraged to do the things that are neither in our power nor voluntary. It is assumed that there is no gain in being persuaded not to be hot or in pain or hungry or the like, since we shall experience these feelings none the less. Indeed, we punish a man for his very ignorance, if he is thought responsible for the ignorance, as when penalties are doubled in the case of drunkenness. For the moving principle is in the man himself, since he had the power of not getting drunk, and his getting drunk was the cause of his ignorance. And we punish those who are ignorant of anything in the laws that they ought to know, and that is not difficult, and so too in the case of anything else that they are thought to be ignorant of through carelessness. We assume that it is in their power not to be ignorant, since they have the power of taking care. But perhaps a man is the kind of man not to take care. Still they are themselves by their slack lives responsible for becoming men of that kind, and men make themselves responsible for being unjust or self-indulgent, in the one case by cheating and in the other by spending their time in drinking bouts and the like, for it is activities exercised on particular objects that make the corresponding character. This is plain from the case of people training for any contest or action. They practice the activity the whole time. Now, not to know that it is from the exercise of activities on particular objects that states of character are produced is the mark of a thoroughly senseless person. Again, it is irrational to suppose that a man who acts unjustly does not wish to be unjust, or a man who acts self-indulgently to be self-indulgent. But if without being ignorant a man does the things which will make him unjust, he will be unjust voluntarily. Yet it does not follow that if he wishes he will cease to be unjust and will be just, for neither does the man who is ill become well on those terms. We may suppose a case in which he is ill voluntarily, through living incontinently and disobeying his doctors. In that case it was then open to him not to be ill, but not now when he has thrown away his chance. Just as when you have let a stone go it is too late to recover it, but yet it was in your power to throw it, since the moving principle was in you. So too, to the unjust and to the self-indulgent man, it was open at the beginning not to become men of this kind, and so they are unjust and self-indulgent voluntarily, but now that they have become so it is not possible for them not to be so. But not only are the vices of the soul voluntary, but those of the body also for some men, whom we accordingly blame. While no one blames those who are ugly by nature, we blame those who are so owing to want of exercise and care. So it is, too, with respect to weakness and infirmity. No one would reproach a man blind from birth or by disease or from a blow, but rather pity him. While everyone would blame a man who was blind from drunkenness or some other form of self-indulgence. Of vices of the body, then, those in our own power are blamed, those not in our power are not. And if this be so, in the other cases also the vices that are blamed must be in our own power. Now someone may say that all men desire the apparent good, but have no control over the appearance, but the end appears to each man in a form answering to his character. We reply that if each man is somehow responsible for his state of mind, he will also be himself somehow responsible for the appearance. But if not, no one is responsible for his own evil doing. But everyone does evil acts through ignorance of the end, thinking that by these he will get what is best. And the aiming at the end is not self-chosen, but one must be born with an eye, as it were, by which to judge rightly and choose what is truly good, and he is well endowed by nature who is well endowed with this. For it is what is greatest and most noble, and what we cannot get or learn from another, but must have just such as it was when given us at birth, and to be well and nobly endowed with this will be perfect in true excellence of natural endowment. If this is true, then, how will virtue be more voluntary than vice? To both men alike, the good and the bad, the end appears and is fixed by nature, or however it may be. And it is by referring everything else to this that men do whatever they do. Whether then it is not by nature that the end appears to each man such as it does appear, but something also depends on him, or the end is natural, but because the good man adopts the means voluntarily, virtue is voluntary, vice also will be none the less voluntary. For in the case of the bad man there is equally present that which depends on himself in his actions, even if not in his end. If then, as is asserted, the virtues are voluntary, for we are ourselves somehow partly responsible for our states of character, and it is by being persons of a certain kind that we assume the end to be so and so, the vices also will be voluntary, for the same is true of them. With regard to the virtues in general, we have stated their genus in outline, viz., that they are means and that they are states of character, and that they tend, and by their own nature, to the doing of the acts by which they are produced, and that they are in our power and voluntary, and act as the right rule prescribes. But actions and states of character are not voluntary in the same way, for we are masters of our actions from the beginning right to the end. If we know the particular facts, but though we control the beginning of our states of character, the gradual progress is not obvious any more than it is in illnesses. Because it was in our power, however, to act in this way or not in this way, therefore the states are voluntary. Let us take up the several virtues, however, and say which they are, and what sort of things they are concerned with, and how they are concerned with them. At the same time, it will become plain how many they are. And first let us speak of courage. That it is a mean with regard to feelings of fear and confidence has already been made evident, and plainly the things we fear are terrible things, and these are, to speak without qualification, evils, for which reason people even define fear as expectation of evil. Now we fear all evils, e.g. disgrace, poverty, disease, friendlessness, death, but the brave man is not thought to be concerned with all, for to fear some things is even right and noble. And it is base not to fear them, e.g. disgrace. He who fears this is good and modest, and he who does not is shameless. He is, however, by some people called brave, by a transference of the word to a new meaning, for he has in him something which is like the brave man, since the brave man also is a fearless person. Poverty and disease we perhaps ought not to fear, nor in general the things that do not proceed from vice and are not due to a man himself. but not even the man who is fearless of these is brave. Yet we apply the word to him also in virtue of a similarity. For some who in the dangers of war are cowards are liberal, and are confident in face of the loss of money. Nor is a man a coward if he fears insult to his wife and children, or envy, or anything of the kind. Nor brave if he is confident when he is about to be flogged. With what sort of terrible things, then, is the brave man concerned? Surely with the greatest, for no one is more likely than he to stand his ground against what is awe-inspiring. Now death is the most terrible of all things, for it is the end, and nothing is thought to be any longer either good or bad for the dead. But the brave man would not seem to be concerned even with death in all circumstances, e.g. at sea or in disease. In what circumstances, then? Surely in the noblest. Now such deaths are those in battle, for these take place in the greatest and noblest danger, and these are correspondingly honored in city-states and at the courts of monarchs. Properly then he will be called brave who is fearless in face of a noble death, and of all emergencies that involve death. And the emergencies of war are in the highest degree of this kind. Yet at sea also, and in disease, the brave man is fearless, but not in the same way as the seaman, for he has given up hope of safety, and is disliking the thought of death in this shape, while they are hopeful because of their experience. At the same time, we show courage in situations where there is the opportunity of showing prowess, or where death is noble. But in these forms of death, neither of these conditions is fulfilled. What is terrible is not the same for all men, but we say there are things terrible even beyond human strength. These, then, are terrible to everyone, at least to every sensible man. But the terrible things that are not beyond human strength differ in magnitude and degree, and so too do the things that inspire confidence. Now the brave man is as dauntless as man may be. Therefore, while he will fear even the things that are not beyond human strength, he will face them as he ought and as the rule directs, for honor's sake, for this is the end of virtue. But it is possible to fear these more or less, and again to fear things that are not terrible as if they were. Of the faults that are committed, one consists in fearing what one should not, another in fearing as we should not, another in fearing when we should not, and so on, and so too with respect to the things that inspire confidence. The man then who faces and who fears the right things and from the right motive, in the right way and from the right time, and who feels confidence under the corresponding conditions, is brave. For the brave man feels and acts according to the merits of the case and in whatever way the rule directs. Now the end of every activity is conformity to the corresponding state of character. This is true, therefore, of the brave man as well as of others, but courage is noble. Therefore the end also is noble, for each thing is defined by its end. Therefore it is for a noble end that the brave man endures and acts as courage directs. Of those who go to excess, he who exceeds in fearlessness has no name. We have said previously that many states of character have no names, but he would be a sort of madman or insensible person if he feared nothing, neither earthquakes nor the waves, as they say the Celts do not, while the man who exceeds in confidence about what really is terrible is rash. The rash man, however, is also thought to be boastful and only a pretender to courage, at all events. As the brave man is with regard to what is terrible, so the rash man wishes to appear, and so he imitates him in situations where he can. Hence also most of them are a mixture of rashness and cowardice, for while in these situations they display confidence, they do not hold their ground against what is really terrible. The man who exceeds in fear is a coward, for he fears both what he ought not and as he ought not, and all the similar characterizations attached to him. He is lacking also in confidence, but he is more conspicuous for his excessive fear in painful situations. The coward then is a despairing sort of person, for he fears everything. The brave man, on the other hand, has the opposite disposition, for confidence is the mark of a hopeful disposition. The coward, the rash man, and the brave man, then, are concerned with the same objects but are differently disposed towards them. For the first two exceed and fall short, while the third holds the middle, which is the right position, and rash men are precipitate and wish for dangers beforehand but draw back when they are in them, while brave men are keen in the moment of action but quiet beforehand. As we have said, then, courage is a mean with respect to things that inspire confidence or fear in the circumstances that have been stated, and it chooses or endures things because it is noble to do so, or because it is base not to do so. But to die to escape from poverty or love or anything painful is not the mark of a brave man, but rather of a coward, for it is softness to fly from what is troublesome. And such a man endures death not because it is noble, but to fly from evil. Courage, then, is something of this sort, but the name is also applied to 5 other kinds. First comes the courage of the citizen soldier, for this is most like true courage. Citizen soldiers seem to face dangers because of the penalties imposed by the laws and the reproaches they would otherwise incur, and because of the honors they win by such action, and therefore those people seem to be bravest among whom cowards are held in dishonor and brave men in honor. This is the kind of courage that Homer depicts, e.g. in Diomed and in Hector. First will Polydamas be to heap reproach on me then, and for Hector one day mid the Trojans shall utter his vaulting harangue, afraid was Tydides and fled from my face. This kind of courage is most like to that which we described earlier, because it is due to virtue, for it is due to shame and to desire of a noble object, i.e. honor and avoidance of disgrace, which is ignoble. One might rank in the same class even those who are compelled by their rulers, but they are inferior, inasmuch as they do what they do not from shame but from fear, and to avoid not what is disgraceful but what is painful, for their masters compel them, as Hector does. But if I shall spy any dastard that cowers far from the fight, vainly will such an one hope to escape from the dogs. And those who give them their posts and beat them if they retreat do the same, and so do those who draw them up with trenches or something of the sort behind them. All of these apply compulsion. But one ought to be brave not under compulsion, but because it is noble to be so. 2. Experience with regard to particular facts is also thought to be courage. This is indeed the reason why Socrates thought courage was knowledge. Other people exhibit this quality in other dangers, and professional soldiers exhibit it in the dangers of war, for there seem to be many empty alarms in war, of which these have had the most comprehensive experience. Therefore they seem brave, because the others do not know the nature of the facts. Again, their experience makes them most capable in attack and in defense, since they can use their arms and have the kind that are likely to be best both for attack and for defense. Therefore they fight like armed men against unarmed, or like trained athletes against amateurs. For in such contests too it is not the bravest men that fight best, but those who are strongest and have their bodies in the best condition. Professional soldiers turn cowards, however, when the danger puts too great a strain on them and they are inferior in numbers and equipment, for they are the first to fly, while citizen forces die at their posts, as in fact happened at the Temple of Hermes. For to the latter flight is disgraceful, and death is preferable to safety on those terms, while the former from the very beginning faced the danger on the assumption that they were stronger, and when they know the facts they fly, fearing death more than disgrace. But the brave man is not that sort of person. 3. Passion also is sometimes reckoned as courage. Those who act from passion, like wild beasts rushing at those who have wounded them, are thought to be brave, because brave men also are passionate. For passion above all things is eager to rush on danger, and hence Homer's put strength into his passion and aroused their spirit and passion, and hard he breathed panting and his blood boiled. For all such expressions seem to indicate the stirring and onset of passion. Now brave men act for honor's sake, but passion aids them, while wild beasts act under the influence of pain, for they attack because they have been wounded or because they are afraid, since if they are in a forest they do not come near one. Thus they are not brave because, driven by pain and passion, they rush on danger without foreseeing any of the perils, since at that rate even asses would be brave when they are hungry, for blows will not drive them from their food, and lust also makes adulterers do many daring things. Those creatures are not brave, then, which are driven on to danger by pain or passion. The courage that is due to passion seems to be the most natural, and to be courage if choice and motive be added. Men then, as well as beasts, suffer pain when they are angry, and are pleased when they exact their revenge. Those who fight for these reasons, however, are pugnacious but not brave, for they do not act for honor's sake nor as the rule directs, but from strength of feeling. They have, however, something akin to courage. 4. Nor are sanguine people brave, for they are confident in danger only because they have conquered often and against many foes. Yet they closely resemble brave men because both are confident, but brave men are confident for the reasons stated earlier, while these are so because they think they are the strongest and can suffer nothing. Drunken men also behave in this way. They become sanguine. When their adventures do not succeed, however, they run away. But it was the mark of a brave man to face things that are and seem terrible for a man, because it is noble to do so and disgraceful not to do so. Hence also it is thought the mark of a braver man to be fearless and undisturbed in sudden alarms than to be so in those that are foreseen, for it must have proceeded more from a state of character, because less from preparation. Acts that are foreseen may be chosen by calculation and rule, but sudden actions must be in accordance with one state of character. 5. People who are ignorant of the danger also appear brave, and they are not far removed from those of a sanguine temper, but are inferior inasmuch as they have no self-reliance while these have. Hence also the sanguine hold their ground for a time, but those who have been deceived about the facts fly if they know or suspect that these are different from what they supposed, as happened to the Argives when they fell in with the Spartans and took them for Sicyonians. We have then described the character both of brave men and of those who are thought to be brave. Though courage is concerned with feelings of confidence and of fear, it is not concerned with both alike, but more with the things that inspire fear. For he who is undisturbed in face of these and bears himself as he should towards these is more truly brave than the man who does so toward the things that inspire confidence. It is for facing what is painful, then, as has been said, that men are called brave. Hence also courage involves pain and is justly praised. For it is harder to face what is painful than to abstain from what is pleasant. Yet the end which courage sets before it would seem to be pleasant, but to be concealed by the attending circumstances, as happens also in athletic contests. For the end at which boxers aim is pleasant, the crown and the honors, but the blows they take are distressing to flesh and blood and painful, and so is their whole exertion. And because the blows and the exertions are many, the end, which is but small, appears to have nothing pleasant in it. And so, if the case of courage is similar. Death and wounds will be painful to the brave man and against his will, but he will face them because it is noble to do so or because it is base not to do so. And the more he is possessed of virtue in its entirety and the happier he is, the more he will be pained at the thought of death. For life is best worth living for such a man, and he is knowingly losing the greatest goods, and this is painful. But he is none the less brave, and perhaps all the more so because he chooses noble deeds of war at that cost. It is not the case, then, with all the virtues that the exercise of them is pleasant, except in so far as it reaches its end. But it is quite possible that the best soldiers may be not men of this sort, but those who are less brave but have no other good, for these are ready to face danger, and they sell their life for trifling gains. So much, then, for courage. It is not difficult to grasp its nature and outline, at any rate, from what has been said. After courage, let us speak of temperance, for these seem to be the virtues of the irrational parts. We have said that temperance is a mean with regard to pleasures, for it is less, and not in the same way, concerned with pain. Self-indulgence also is manifested in the same sphere. Now, therefore, let us determine with what sort of pleasures they are concerned. We may assume the distinction between bodily pleasures and those of the soul, such as love of honor and love of learning. For the lover of each of these delights in that of which he is a lover, the body being in no way affected, but rather the mind. But men who are concerned with such pleasures are called neither temperate nor self-indulgent. Nor again are those who are concerned with the other pleasures that are not bodily. For those who are fond of hearing and telling stories and who spend their days on anything that turns up are called gossips, but not self-indulgent, nor are those who are pained at the loss of money or of friends. Temperance must be concerned with bodily pleasures, but not all even of these. For those who delight in objects of vision, such as colors and shapes and painting, are called neither temperate nor self-indulgent. Yet it would seem possible to delight even in these either as one should, or to excess, or to a deficient degree. And so too is it with objects of hearing. No one calls those who delight extravagantly in music or acting self-indulgent, nor those who do so as they ought temperate. Nor do we apply these names to those who delight in odor, unless it be incidentally. We do not call those self-indulgent who delight in the odor of apples or roses or incense, but rather those who delight in the odor of unguents or of dainty dishes. For self-indulgent people delight in these because these remind them of the objects of their appetite. And one may see even other people, when they are hungry, delighting in the smell of food. But to delight in this kind of thing is the mark of the self-indulgent man, for these are objects of appetite to him. Nor is there in animals other than man any pleasure connected with these senses, except incidentally. For dogs do not delight in the scent of hares, but in the eating of them, but the scent told them the hares were there. Nor does the lion delight in the lowing of the ox, but in eating it. But he perceived by the lowing that it was near, and therefore appears to delight in the lowing. And similarly he does not delight because he sees a stag or a wild goat, but because he is going to make a meal of it. Temperance and self-indulgence, however, are concerned with the kind of pleasures that the other animals share in, which therefore appear slavish and brutish. These are touch and taste. But even of taste they appear to make little or no use, for the business of taste is the discriminating of flavors, which is done by wine tasters and people who season dishes. But they hardly take pleasure in making these discriminations, or at least self-indulgent people do not, but in the actual enjoyment, which in all cases comes through touch, both in the case of food and in that of drink, and in that of sexual intercourse. This is why a certain gourmand prayed that his throat might become longer than a crane's, implying that it was the contact that he took pleasure in. Thus the sense with which self-indulgence is connected is the most widely shared of the senses, and self-indulgence would seem to be justly a matter of reproach, because it attaches to us not as men but as animals. To delight in such things, then, and to love them above all others, is brutish. For even of the pleasures of touch the most liberal have been eliminated, e.g. those produced in the gymnasium by rubbing and by the consequent heat, for the contact characteristic of the self-indulgent man does not affect the whole body but only certain parts. Of the appetite some seem to be common, others to be peculiar to individuals and acquired. e.g., the appetite for food is natural, since everyone who is without it craves for food or drink, and sometimes for both, and for love also, as Homer says, if he is young and lusty. But not everyone craves for this or that kind of nourishment or love, nor for the same things. Hence such craving appears to be our very own, yet it has of course something natural about it. For different things are pleasant to different kinds of people, and some things are more pleasant to every one than chance objects. Now in the natural appetites few go wrong, and only in one direction, that of excess. For to eat or drink whatever offers itself till one is surfeited is to exceed the natural amount, since natural appetite is the replenishment of one's deficiency. Hence these people are called belligods, this implying that they fill their belly beyond what is right. It is people of entirely slavish character that become like this. But with regard to the pleasures peculiar to individuals, many people go wrong, and in many ways. For while the people who are fond of so-and-so are so called because they delight either in the wrong things, or more than most people do, or in the wrong way, the self-indulgent exceed in all three ways. They both delight in some things that they ought not to delight in, since they are hateful, and if one ought to delight in some of the things they delight in, they do so more than one ought and than most men do. Plainly then, excess with regard to pleasures is self-indulgence and is culpable. With regard to pains one is not, as in the case of courage, called temperate for facing them or self-indulgent for not doing so. But the self-indulgent man is so called because he is pained more than he ought at not getting pleasant things, even his pain being caused by pleasure. And the temperate man is so called because he is not pained at the absence of what is pleasant and at his abstinence from it. The self-indulgent man then craves for all pleasant things or those that are most pleasant, and is led by his appetite to choose these at the cost of everything else. Hence he is pained both when he fails to get them, and when he is merely craving for them, for appetite involves pain, but it seems absurd to be pained for the sake of pleasure. People who fall short with regard to pleasures and delight in them less than they should are hardly found. For such insensibility is not human. Even the other animals distinguish different kinds of food and enjoy some and not others. And if there is anyone who finds nothing pleasant and nothing more attractive than anything else, he must be something quite different from a man. This sort of person has not received a name because he hardly occurs. The temperate man occupies a middle position with regard to these objects, for he neither enjoys the things that the self-indulgent man enjoys most, but rather dislikes them, nor in general the things that he should not, nor anything of this sort to excess, nor does he feel pain or craving when they are absent, or does so only to a moderate degree, and not more than he should, nor when he should not, and so on, but the things that, being pleasant, make for health or for good condition, he will desire moderately and as he should, and also other pleasant things if they are not hindrances to these ends, or contrary to what is noble, or beyond his means. For he who neglects these conditions loves such pleasures more than they are worth, but the temperate man is not that sort of person, but the sort of person that the right rule prescribes. Self-indulgence is more like a voluntary state than cowardice, for the former is actuated by pleasure, the latter by pain, of which the one is to be chosen and the other to be avoided, and pain upsets and destroys the nature of the person who feels it, while pleasure does nothing of the sort. Therefore self-indulgence is more voluntary. Hence also it is more a matter of reproach, for it is easier to become accustomed to its objects, since there are many things of this sort in life. And the process of habituation to them is free from danger, while with terrible objects the reverse is the case. But cowardice would seem to be voluntary in a different degree from its particular manifestations, for it is itself painless, but in these we are upset by pain, so that we even throw down our arms and disgrace ourselves in other ways. Hence our acts are even thought to be done under compulsion. For the self-indulgent man, on the other hand, the particular acts are voluntary, for he does them with craving and desire, but the whole state is less so. For no one craves to be self-indulgent. The name self-indulgence is applied also to childish faults, for they bear a certain resemblance to what we have been considering, which is called after which makes no difference to our present purpose. Plainly, however, the later is called after the earlier. The transference of the name seems not a bad one, for that which desires what is base and which develops quickly ought to be kept in a chastened condition, and these characteristics belong above all to appetite and to the child. Since children in fact live at the beck and call of appetite, and it is in them that the desire for what is pleasant is strongest. If then it is not going to be obedient and subject to the ruling principle, it will go to great lengths, for in an irrational being the desire for pleasure is insatiable even if it tries every source of gratification, and the exercise of appetite increases its innate force, and if appetites are strong and violent, they even expel the power of calculation. Hence they should be moderate and few, and should in no way oppose the rational principle, and this is what we call an obedient and chastened state, and, as the child should live according to the direction of his tutor, so the appetitive element should live according to rational principle. Hence the appetitive element in a temperate man should harmonize with the rational principle, for the noble is the mark at which both aim, and the temperate man craves for the things be ought, as when he ought, and when he ought, and this is what rational principle directs. Here we conclude our account of temperance. Book Roman 4. Let us speak next of liberality. It seems to be the mean with regard to wealth, for the liberal man is praised not in respect of military matters, nor of those in respect of which the temperate man is praised, nor of judicial decisions, but with regard to the giving and taking of wealth, and especially in respect of giving. Now by wealth we mean all the things whose value is measured by money. Further, prodigality and meanness are excesses and defects with regard to wealth. In meanness we always impute to those who care more than they ought for wealth, but we sometimes apply the word prodigality in a complex sense, for we call those men prodigals who are incontinent and spend money on self-indulgence. Hence also they are thought the poorest characters, for they combine more vices than one. Therefore the application of the word to them is not its proper use, for prodigal means a man who has a single evil quality, that of wasting his substance. Since a prodigal is one who is being ruined by his own fault, and the wasting of substance is thought to be a sort of ruining of oneself, life being held to depend on possession of substance. This then is the sense in which we take the word prodigality. Now the things that have a use may be used either well or badly, and riches is a useful thing, and everything is used best by the man who has the virtue concerned with it. Riches therefore will be used best by the man who has the virtue concerned with wealth, and this is the liberal man. Now spending and giving seem to be the using of wealth, taking and keeping rather the possession of it. Hence it is more the mark of the liberal man to give to the right people than to take from the right sources, and not to take from the wrong. For it is more characteristic of virtue to do good than to have good done to one, and more characteristic to do what is noble than not to do what is base. And it is not hard to see that giving implies doing good and doing what is noble, and taking implies having good done to one or not acting basely. And gratitude is felt towards him who gives, not towards him who does not take, and praise also is bestowed more on him. It is easier also not to take than to give, for men are apter to give away their own too little than to take what is another's. Givers too are called liberal, but those who do not take are not praised for liberality but rather for justice, while those who take are hardly praised at all. And the liberal are almost the most loved of all virtuous characters, since they are useful, and this depends on their giving. Now virtuous actions are noble and done for the sake of the noble. Therefore the liberal man, like other virtuous men, will give for the sake of the noble, and rightly, for he will give to the right people the right amounts, and at the right time, with all the other qualifications that accompany right giving, and that too with pleasure or without pain. For that which is virtuous is pleasant or free from pain, least of all will it be painful. But he who gives to the wrong people, or not for the sake of the noble but for some other cause, will be called not liberal but by some other name. Nor is he liberal who gives with pain, for he would prefer the wealth to the noble act, and this is not characteristic of a liberal man. But no more will the liberal man take from wrong sources, for such taking is not characteristic of the man who sets no store by wealth. Nor will he be a ready asker, for it is not characteristic of a man who confers benefits to accept them lightly. But he will take from the right sources, e.g. from his own possessions, not as something noble but as a necessity, that he may have something to give. Nor will he neglect his own property, since he wishes by means of this to help others, and he will refrain from giving to anybody and everybody, that he may have something to give to the right people at the right time and where it is noble to do so. It is highly characteristic of a liberal man also to go to excess in giving, so that he leaves too little for himself, for it is the nature of a liberal man not to look to himself. The term liberality is used relatively to a man's substance, for liberality resides not in the multitude of the gifts but in the state of character of the giver, and this is relative to the giver's substance. There is therefore nothing to prevent the man who gives less from being the more liberal man. If he has less to give, those are thought to be more liberal who have not made their wealth but inherited it, for in the first place they have no experience of want. And secondly, all men are fonder of their own productions, as are parents and poets. It is not easy for the liberal man to be rich, since he is not apt either at taking or at keeping, but at giving away, and does not value wealth for its own sake but as a means to giving. Hence comes the charge that is brought against fortune, that those who deserve riches most get at least. But it is not unreasonable that it should turn out so, for he cannot have wealth any more than anything else if he does not take pains to have it. Yet he will not give to the wrong people nor at the wrong time, and so on, for he would no longer be acting in accordance with liberality, and if he spent on these objects he would have nothing to spend on the right objects, for as has been said, he is liberal who spends according to his substance and on the right objects. And he who exceeds is prodigal. Hence we do not call despots prodigal, for it is thought not easy for them to give and spend beyond the amount of their possessions. Liberality then being a mean with regard to giving and taking of wealth, The liberal man will both give and spend the right amounts and on the right objects, alike in small things and in great, and that with pleasure. He will also take the right amounts and from the right sources. For the virtue being a mean with regard to both, he will do both as he ought, since this sort of taking accompanies proper giving, and that which is not of this sort is contrary to it. And accordingly the giving and taking that accompany each other are present together in the same man, while the contrary kinds evidently are not. But if he happens to spend in a manner contrary to what is right and noble, he will be pained, but moderately and as he ought, for it is the mark of virtue both to be pleased and to be pained at the right objects and in the right way. Further, the liberal man is easy to deal with in money matters, for he can be got the better of, since he sets no store by money, and is more annoyed if he has not spent something that he ought than pained if he has spent something that he ought not, and does not agree with the saying of Simonides. The prodigal errs in these respects also, for he is neither pleased nor pained at the right things or in the right way. This will be more evident as we go on. We have said that prodigality and meanness are excesses and deficiencies, and in two things, in giving and in taking, for we include spending under giving. Now prodigality exceeds in giving and not taking, while meanness falls short in giving and exceeds in taking, except in small things. The characteristics of prodigality are not often combined, for it is not easy to give to all if you take from none. Private persons soon exhaust their substance with giving, and it is to these that the name of prodigals is applied, though a man of this sort would seem to be in no small degree better than a mean man, for he is easily cured both by age and by poverty, and thus he may move towards the middle state, for he has the characteristics of the liberal man. Since he both gives and refrains from taking, though he does neither of these in the right manner or well. Therefore, if he were brought to do so by habituation or in some other way, he would be liberal, for he will then give to the right people, and will not take from the wrong sources. This is why he is thought to have not a bad character. It is not the mark of a wicked or ignoble man to go to excess in giving and not taking, but only of a foolish one. The man who is prodigal in this way is thought much better than the mean man, both for the aforesaid reasons, and because he benefits many while the other benefits no one, not even himself. But most prodigal people, as has been said, also take from the wrong sources and are in this respect mean. They become apt to take because they wish to spend and cannot do this easily, for their possessions soon run short. Thus they are forced to provide means from some other source. At the same time, because they care nothing for honor, they take recklessly and from any source, for they have an appetite for giving, and they do not mind how or from what source. Hence also their giving is not liberal, for it is not noble, nor does it aim at nobility, nor is it done in the right way. Sometimes they make rich those who should be poor, and will give nothing to people of respectable character, and much to flatterers or those who provide them with some other pleasure. Hence also most of them are self-indulgent, for they spend lightly and waste money on their indulgences, and incline towards pleasures, because they do not live with a view to what is noble. The prodigal man then turns into what we have described if he is left untutored, but if he is treated with care he will arrive at the intermediate and right state. But meanness is both incurable, for old age and every disability is thought to make men mean, and more innate in men than prodigality, for most men are fonder of getting money than of giving. It also extends widely and is multiform, since there seem to be many kinds of meanness. For it consists in two things, deficiency in giving and excess in taking, and is not found complete in all men, but is sometimes divided. Some men go to excess in taking, others fall short in giving. Those who are called by such names as miserly, close, stingy, all fall short in giving, but do not covet the possessions of others nor wish to get them. In some this is due to a sort of honesty and avoidance of what is disgraceful, for some seem, or at least profess, to hoard their money for this reason, that they may not some day be forced to do something disgraceful. To this class belong the cheese-bearer and every one of the sort. He is so called from his excessive unwillingness to give anything, while others again keep their hands off the property of others from fear, on the ground that it is not easy, if one takes the property of others oneself, to avoid having one's own taken by them. They are therefore content neither to take nor to give. Others again exceed in respect of taking by taking anything and from any source, e.g. those who ply sordid trades, pimps and all such people, and those who lend small sums and at high rates. For all of these take more than they ought and from wrong sources. What is common to them is evidently sordid love of gain. They all put up with a bad name for the sake of gain, and little gain at that. For those who make great gains but from wrong sources, and not the right gains, e.g. despots when they sack cities and spoil temples, we do not call mean but rather wicked, impious and unjust. But the gamester and the footpad and the highwayman belong to the class of the mean, since they have a sordid love of gain. For it is for gain that both of them ply their craft and endure the disgrace of it, and the one faces the greatest dangers for the sake of the booty, while the other makes gain from his friends, to whom he ought to be giving. Both, then, since they are willing to make gain from wrong sources, are sordid lovers of gain. Therefore all such forms of taking are mean. And it is natural that meanness is described as the contrary of liberality, for not only is it a greater evil than prodigality, but men err more often in this direction than in the way of prodigality as we have described it. So much then for liberality and the opposed vices.